Research indicates that the human brain seems to be wired to categorize people by race in the first 1/5 second after seeing a face. Studies suggest that all people have an ingrained propensity to bias, even if they're unaware or disapprove of the bias. This natural, unconscious bias creates a number of challenges for minority managers and employees. Let's take a look. Unconscious bias occurs when a person is not aware of the bias in his or her favorable and unfavorable assessments, actions, and decisions towards members of a specific group. Consider the following findings regarding unconscious bias, sometimes referred to as implicit bias. When researchers mailed thousands of similar resumes, some with stereotypical black names, such as Jamal, and some with stereotypically white names, such as Emily, to organizations with job openings, the resumes with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to result in a request for an interview. Research has found that women who come to the emergency room with a stroke wait 15% longer than men to get brain imaging, even when they have similar symptoms. Doctors who were shown patient histories and asked to make decisions about heart disease were much less likely to recommend cardiac catheterization, a helpful procedure, to black patients, even when their medical histories were statistically identical to those of white patients. Several studies have also found that email messages with stereotypical black names sent in response to an apartment rental ad on Craigslist get fewer responses than ones with white-sounding names. And finally, studies of state legislatures have found that white legislatures in both political parties are less likely to respond to constituents with African American sounding names. Beyond hidden or unconscious implicit bias, there are still examples of open and blatant prejudice and discrimination in organizations. Prejudice is the tendency to view people who are different as being deficient. Discrimination occurs when someone acts out of their negative attitudes toward people who are the targets of their prejudice. Paying a woman less than a man for the same work is gender discrimination. Mistreating people because they have a different ethnicity is ethnic discrimination. Although blatant discrimination is not as widespread as in the past, bias in the workplace often shows up in subtle ways. A survey found that 59% of minority managers surveyed had observed a racially motivated double standard in the delegation of assignments. One interesting recent study found that while talkative men tend to be as powerful and competent, talkative women tend to be perceived as less competent and pushy. Stereotypes are rigid, exaggerated, irrational beliefs associated with a particular group of people. To be successful managing diversity, managers need to eliminate harmful stereotypes from their thinking, shedding any biases that negatively affect the workplace. Stereotypes are often based on folklore, media portrayals, and other unreliable sources of information. For example, studies have shown that the traditional stereotype of a good manager is masculine and reflects characteristics such as assertiveness and competitiveness. Increasingly, however, for people who have worked in organizations with a high percentage of female managers, that stereotype no longer exists. Those employees often show a stronger preference for feminine characteristics, such as caring and compassion. Legitimate cultural differences are backed up by systematic research of real differences, not folklore and supposition. Stereotypes also contain negative connotations. On the other hand, managers who value diversity view differences as potentially positive or neutral. For example, the observation that Asian males are typically less aggressive does not imply they're inferior or superior to white males. It simply means there's a difference. Stereotypes assume that all members of a group have the same characteristics. Managers who value diversity recognize that individuals within a group of people may or may not share the same characteristics. Managers need to learn how to value differences, which means they recognize individual differences and see these differences with an appropriate attitude. To facilitate this attitude, managers can learn about cultural patterns and typical beliefs of groups to help understand why people act the way they do.